Hello. This is probably going to be a pretty long video, so you may want to look at timestamps in the description. That's because the subject of today's video is the multiplier. And I think it would not be overselling the multiplier to say that it is the single most useful CV module there is. It performs so many different functions in so many different capacities that it really becomes this essential way, particularly when you want to talk about using multiple CV sources together. So a multiplier can be an attenuator, an attenuverter, it can be a mixer, it can be a logic gate, it can be a wave shaper, it can be a way of adjusting the curves of different modules and how they perform. And I'm going to go over some of that. I've covered some of it in some other videos, and I'll try to point out those videos as we arrive at them. But before I begin, I want to go over two quick things, both of which will date this video somewhat, and I hope both of them actually make it seem outdated pretty quickly. The first is that I am making this right now in the United States as the coronavirus becomes a very real threat and a very real impedance to everyday life. I know that some of you overseas have been dealing with this much longer, and I just want to say I hope everyone is safe and healthy and that your loved ones are safe and healthy. And so if you find you need anything because of the coronavirus that I can help with, please do not hesitate to reach out. So that's the first announcement. And the second announcement is that me and Mean Median Moog and Empress Effects have been putting together this idea for a birthday party for ZOIA. If you haven't seen the announcement, check out the R ZOIA Reddit or the Facebook, the Empress ZOIA users page, and that's where we're gonna be announcing some more stuff coming up. We've already announced a giveaway that you can enter. So the idea is just, to do something that recognizes ZOIA, which if you're watching this video, you have some appreciation of, I'm guessing, but also the community that has grown up around ZOIA, which, is pretty fantastic. So those announcements aside, the first place I'm going to begin with the multiplier is just sort of talking about what the multiplier does. And the multiplier, and this is going to sound like, there's no way to put this where it doesn't sound like I'm saying something really dumb, but the multiplier multiplies. I mean, that's what it does. It takes two CV values and it multiplies them together and produces the product of that multiplication. Now, the way in which this may confuse people is we're used to multiplying by whole numbers. So 2 times 4 equals 8. And we get a product that is larger than either of the things that we're multiplying together. The multiplier in ZOIA works differently. It's more like division than it is like multiplication if you think about how you use it in your everyday life, because what you're doing is multiplying something like a CV value of 1 by a CV value of 0.5 and getting 0.5, or a CV value of 0.5 by a CV value of 0.5 and getting 0.25. So in both of these cases, it would be like dividing by 2 in the first one, this would be, multiplying 1/2 by 1/2 is 1/4. So I think that throws a lot of people off because they expect multipliers. When you think about multiplication in everyday life, you're usually thinking about it, I think, in terms of whole numbers or numbers greater than 1. When the number is less than 1, its outcome produces a number that is smaller than or equal to either of the products. And so I think, people look at this and they go, oh, I made a smaller number. What do I do with that? And so it turns out you can do a whole lot with that. And I'm going to move through some of this stuff quickly, just because, like I said, the multiplier is so diverse. It can do so many things. And I think that I could spend a lot of time on every one of the subjects. But the first place I want to talk about is attenuation. And attenuation is basically controlling how strong or weak a signal is. I'm going to take a break now and patch something up to demonstrate this, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got my example patched up to demonstrate attenuation. What I have down here is a keyboard module. The note output is going to an oscillator on the second page. The gate output is going to this ADSR, which I've just loaded in the default condition with all the default values, and then I've sent it to the VCA. The oscillator goes into a VCA, and then the VCA goes into a filter, and it's going to the filter's cutoff frequency. So when I play a note, the ADSR shapes how the VCA opens, and it also shapes how the cutoff frequency rises in frequency, and the sound becomes brighter. But let me make sure that this is loud enough. But this is a pretty bright sound, and maybe I don't want it to be that bright. Now I can adjust the connection strength, right? And that's one way to approach attenuation. We can, adjust connection strength, and that will allow us to increase or decrease the strength of the connection. But another way to do that is by sending the ADSR into a multiplier. And what I have here is a multiplier. In the first input, I put the ADSR, and in the second input, I have a value module. And what the value module is going to do is mimic us controlling the connection strength. It won't be able to exceed the value of 100%, but in CV, we often don't want to do this. There are cases where we do, and we can talk about them maybe later. But in most cases, we don't want to exceed 100% because our CV modules go between 0 and 1, and that's the limit of how much CV can be applied to any target. So right now, if I play, we don't hear anything because, like I said, this is mimicking our connection strength, and that means that the filter is closed when I play. Now I'm going to turn this all the way up to 1, and it should sound like it did before, unless I forgot to make the connection to the filter, which I did, to the filter's cutoff frequency. But now it should sound like it did before. But we can adjust this, and that means the ADSR will affect the filter less, the cutoff frequency less, so it'll sound darker. Right? And we can adjust it even more, and it should sound even darker or duller. And so the advantage here is that rather than hunt down this connection strength every time, the two ends of the connection, every time I want to adjust how much the CV module affects its destination, I can run it through a multiplier, and then I can also move that multiplier wherever I want. So if I'm putting together a bunch of different controls to adjust CV strength, if I put an ADSR and the filter on the page, that takes up a bunch of the page, whereas this takes up 2 blocks. And I can in fact cover up one of the blocks, the output, with something else if I want. So it's a really useful way for organizing the patch. It also allows you to do something else. So right here I'm using a value module. I'm going to delete that because there are other things that you can route into this input. So I have a MIDI controller. It's off screen over here. It's a Novation Base Station 2, and I've got the mod wheel set up to come in through this MIDI CC in module. And I can use the mod wheel with the multiplier off screen. I'm adjusting the mod wheel. So the multiplier also, you don't have to use it with a value module. You could use an expression pedal. You can use MIDI to attenuate signals, just like you would adjust signal strength, the connection strength, but giving you a lot more flexibility in how to route that. So that's attenuation. The next example I'm going to use is attenuversion, which is just attenuation plus inversion. And this mimics the qualities of both the attenuation that I did with a value module and using a CV invert. But we can do that with one module, and that module is another value module. But instead of being 0 to 1, what we want it to be is -1 to 1. And if we route that through here, we can actually invert the output of our ADSR. So I'm going to show, first I need to bias this because it's set at 0. And if I start using an inverted form, then it will just drop below 0, which won't affect anything. But I can use the inverted form and get an inverted ADSR where it starts out bright and becomes darker rather than starting out dark and becoming brighter. Now, the reason why attenuversion is useful is we could put this at about the middle, and then we can have waveforms through one easy control that we can control both the depth or intensity of them, the connection strength, but also whether they're inverted or non-inverted. And so attenuversion is a really useful application of the multiplier. It's an extension of attenuation. And it's a really useful, I'm going to change this from an ADSR. Actually, I'll keep the ADSR connected to the VCA. Going into the multiplier, I have an LFO down here. I need to adjust it real quickly. Doesn't work as well if you use a bipolar LFO, a LFO that goes from -1 to 1, because then the inversion, well, it's worth looking at too, but we'll come back to it. So I've got an LFO. Now, instead of an ADSR going to the filter, and I can adjust whether it goes above the cutoff frequency that the filter is biased to or below it. So particularly with LFOs and ADSRs, inversion can be really useful. Right? And I'll show you, I talked for a moment about why the LFO should be unipolar instead of bipolar, but we can look at the effect of that. Right, so now we have this in a positive attenuation. If we turn this to a negative attenuation, the output doesn't really change, because what's happening there is that the negative values are canceling each other out. And the positive values are being inverted. So, using with a unipolar waveform, if this is our cutoff frequency, we can have it go above the cutoff frequency or below the cutoff frequency. But if we use a bipolar waveform, it'll just keep going above and below the cutoff frequency, no matter whether the attenuverter is positive or negative, because the signs will cancel one another out. But it still works for attenuation. It just doesn't invert anything. Okay. So we can use this as a way of remotely affecting connection strength. We can also use it as a way to combine different CV signals. And I'm going to keep this connection to the value module, but what I'm going to do is add another input to the multiplier. The multiplier can have up to 8 inputs. I don't think I've ever used all 8, but I have used 6 or so, 7. I'd like to experiment with 8 at some point, but for right now we're using 3. So what I've done is I've reconnected the ADSR. We still have our value module controlling everything, which is going to set our overall depth, the maximum intensity of our signal going to the filter. But I've added this ADSR, and what the ADSR is going to do, this is a classic ADSR shape, the attack, decay, sustain, and release stage. And what the ADSR is going to do is also shape the depth of the LFO. Because again, it's being multiplied by the ADSR. So when the ADSR's CV signal is at its highest, the depth of the LFO will be greatest. And as the ADSR's CV signal drops, the depth of the LFO will also drop, because that limits the range of the LFO. And to make this a little bit more apparent, I'm going to adjust the controls a little bit more, just so that the sustain stage is lower in value and the attack and decay period are longer. Okay. So as you hear this, and Let me turn up our depth a little bit louder. As you hear this, during the attack stage, the depth of the LFO increases, and it reaches the peak and begins the decay stage. And as it starts to decay, the depth or intensity of the LFO, the effect on the filter, begins to diminish, and it reaches the sustain stage and sustains at a diminished amplitude or intensity. So I'm going to do that one more time. Right? It gets very intense as the attack increases, and then it diminishes. So the multiplier allows us to combine signals in this way so that one can control the amplitude of the other. And at the same time, we can continue to attenuate both of the output of that combination. So our value module still continues to determine the peak, the intensity of this combined waveform. So we can turn it down some, and it doesn't get as intense as it reaches the peak, and turn it down a lot, right? And so there are a lot of different ways to combine attenuation with some of the other features of the multiplier and some of the other ways in which it can be employed. And I'm going to talk about one more of them now, and then come back to a different type of example for how I use the multiplier a lot in patches. And that has something to do with the way in which the multiplier functions with CV logic. And the multiplier is ultimately an AND gate. Now, what do I mean by an AND gate? What that means is that in order for anything to pass through the multiplier, the values have to be above 0. And so if I were to add a push button, I'm going to make it latching, and another input to our multiplier, when the push button is on, this signal will pass through the multiplier. But when it's off, that puts a 0 as one of the inputs of the multiplier. And as you know, when you multiply 1 by 0 or 0.5 by 0, the outcome is always 0. So when it's off, nothing will pass. So we're hearing a rise there because the ADSR is still connected to the VCA, but we don't hear any change in the filter, a rise in volume. Okay. And so we can use this with one other input. If we just had an LFO that we wanted to turn off and on, we could use, again, the same sort of push button, or this could be a stomp switch, or it could be, why don't I demonstrate this? It could be our mod wheel again. If this is set to 0, right, then the filter won't be affected. It's only once it rises above 0 that we get any effect. And we can see that same thing happen with our value module. It's going to be easier to dial in 0 with a I'm just going to change this back to a 0 to 1. If I turn this all the way back to 0, so we can cut off the signal as well as attenuate it. Whenever one of the values of a multiplier at any of the inputs is 0, then nothing will be produced from the multiplier. And this is really valuable because we can turn things off. We can produce breaks. I'll show one other example of this, which is, I think, a pretty neat way to do modulation. Just going to, well, I'll keep all of that in place. I'm going to disconnect the ADSR and what I'm going to do is throw in an LFO. So square wave LFO only goes between 1 and 0. And what this means is that a square wave LFO will intermittently pass the signal that goes through the other parts of the multiplier, because it's always on or off. So if we attach this to an input, I'm going to have to reduce the number of inputs again. We can see the effect at our output. Let me change this back to a... Looks much cooler if everything's unipolar. So we get this sort of broken triangle. As we push this up, right, we get this triangle that's broken into little bits and pieces. We can push that even further. Every time the square wave is going high, it's passing the triangle wave, and every time it goes low, it drops to 0. If you look at the screen there, so we get a sound. Let's slow this down a little bit. Slow both of them down a little bit. Slow everything way down. So we get an output that combines both a square wave and a triangle wave. And obviously you can do some really interesting things with these if they're both controlled by the same clock source and you use clock divisions. You can create very rhythmical interruptions in your signal. But this is just one way in which that AND gate can be used by something other than a push button or a value module, because what's happening here is that an AND gate is basically a gate where it's only open when both of the signals are high. In our case, that means above 0. And so, you know, we have the square wave going from 0 to 1, 0 to 1, and when it's at either position, it passes or doesn't pass CV information. So it creates this interrupted triangle. And you can put more complex, let's add that other input back in, more complex CV sources, and still have them be interrupted. So we're going to put our ADSR back in there. and at different speeds. Right, those interruptions at really high, almost audio rates create a sort of distortion. We can turn our LFO up really high too. We can turn our square wave down low so that it has longer periods of on and off. I'm going to bias our filter back to 0. I don't know if that's too low to be picked up by the microphone, but it's creating some very cool sort of rumbling on and off growling low bass notes. So this is a lot of the ways in which the multiplier can be used. It can be used as an attenuator, as an inverter, as an interrupter of CV signals when you put it with a square wave. And obviously, it doesn't have to be a straight square wave. You could have the square wave's rate controlled by something else, so the interruptions came at less regular speeds. It can be a way of combining the amplitudes of waveforms. And so this is, and it can be a logic gate. It can be an on and off switch, where only when both of the signals are high will anything be transmitted. I'm going to show a more classic example of that. I'm just going to go back to 2 inputs. I'm going to disconnect our triangle LFO. I'm going to disconnect our value module, and instead I'm just going to put in 2 square waves. And you'll see here, if you look, that it only goes high when both of the square waves are high. So you get different periods where this filter is opened or closed. So you can combine 2 different square waves to create irregular interruptions in the signal. There are a lot of different possibilities here. I'm not even scratching the surface, but this goes over some of the basics, I think, of the ways in which the multiplier can be used in really common practices, right? It can turn a CV signal on and off. It can raise the amplitude of that CV signal, and it can be used to combine 2 CV signals. So, here we used an ADSR and an LFO. Another common example might be using an envelope follower to control the intensity of an LFO, or using a random module to set random depths for an LFO. So there are just a world of different ways in which these simple applications can be employed. But these are, ways that they can be both employed separately and combined. And so these are the most common basic applications, I think, of the multiplier. I'm going to show a couple of more exotic or idiosyncratic ones that I use sometimes. and that's going to be the subject of the next part of the video, but I need to set some stuff up before I do that. So I'll see you when that's ready. So I'm going to talk about one application of some of the principles I talked about earlier, and also in another video that I did on the CV invert and the CV rectify, which I'll either put a link for in the description or one of those cards. I never click on those cards, just as a aside. So I don't know if people do. Let me know if you do and would like me to try to link more things. So I've also talked about this particular application in another video that I did when I released a patch called utility pages, which was a set of different utilities that could be copied. The pages could be copied and imported into whatever you're working on. And I forget exactly what I called it there. I should have looked that up. But basically what this setup does here is it creates a depth control for modulation that has a feedback built into it. And it does this by using some things that in that video on CV inverts and CV rectifies I call range finding. And what that basically means is, you know, you have some parameter that goes from 0 to 1, and if you have an LFO, the LFO, you know, can go back and forth between, you know, let's say 0.6 and what would be 1.2, except for the parameter can't track that. 1 is the limit, and so when it goes above 1, there's no modulation that occurs. And so the idea here is that the depth control is proportionate to how far that particular point, the starting point, is from either 1 or 0. If it's going, you know, from 0.6 to 1, it'll stop at 0.1, and that will be the largest range you can achieve with positive depth. Right? When this is set to 1, it would go from 0.6 to 0, and when it was set to 0, it would go when it's set to -1, this uses a -1 to 1 value module. When it's set to -1, it would go from 0.6 to 0, and it won't exceed that. It'll be limited. And the way that this is done is that we have a value module, and this is connected to our filter's cutoff frequency, which is the example I've been using throughout this. Right now I have the modulation set to off. I have another one of these push buttons to work as an on-off button, right? I can turn that on, but the value module that sets the frequency of the filter goes into a CV invert and then into a value module that's been biased to 1. And what this does is give us a range, or tell us how far this value is, if we look at it in CV, from 1. So if you add this value and the output of this value, you get 1. And this sets our positive range. This is the distance between, you know, in this example, 0.6 and 1. And it goes into a switch. There's a connection to the switch at exactly 0.5, and what that does is when this depth control passes through 0, right, it's going to change this. The depth control is attached both to the multiplier and to the switch, so when this passes through 0, it'll switch channels. Okay? And when it switches channels, it takes the range from a different source. So in the negative channel, it takes our range from our value module that's already biasing the filter. And the reason why it does that is because we're using negative values. Our depth control is in the negative range. So when they meet at the multiplier, the multiplier will invert this value. And then the second channel takes its output from that value module bias to 1. And what this basically means is that it limits the range of the modulation so that it can't exceed 1 and it can't exceed 0, so that the modulation never hits any spots where it's trying to modulate above a number that can be heard. So I'll just show this off. So right now I have it set up to modulate from its current frequency, and I'm just using the value module output to see what the filter frequency is. So it's going from 783 hertz to 24,000 hertz, which is the maximum output of the filter. And so it's modulating, it's getting brighter and closing. And just to contrast this, I'm going to use this push button, which will produce a constant value of 1, to replace that rangefinder, right? So when this is active, the input here will be 1 instead of the range finding output. And I'll play again. And you hear points in there where it goes up and then it just stops because there's nowhere for it to go beyond where it has already gone. It can't go to 1.2. So what happens there is that it just cuts that off and that modulation becomes flattened. And there are ways to use that aspect in really interesting manners, but you don't find it, for instance, in a lot of synthesizers where you just have dead spots in the modulation. Again, this can be used, without the regulation, without the feedback control, to produce some really cool rhythmic effects, I think. Where the dead spots become part of the modulation. But in our example, what we're doing here is basically just making it so this depth control, the entire range that it has, is applicable. It only goes within this range of 0 to 1 in its modulation, and it doesn't exceed it. So it makes modulation kind of foolproof when you're setting up a depth control, so that you don't have to worry about what happens when you exceed 1 or 0, or try to keep track of that in your mind. It keeps track of that for you. So we still have positive modulation there, but I can turn it negative. And I don't think it'll really pick up very well on the mic, but there are no dead spots when you go negative. There's no point where it flattens out. And so I use this a lot in my patches. If you see one of my patches that has an on-off switch for modulation, and then a depth control that goes from negative to positive, that's the exact outcome, or the exact way in which I'm using it, is this particular structure. I should point out the output of the multiplier is also added to the filter. So the filter is set by the value module. We can change that around. And as we change that around, so I've just increased the sort of bias point of the filter. And that means that the positive depth will have less range because it's working in a narrower field. It gets compressed. So positive modulation becomes much less dramatic even at 1. And negative modulation becomes much more dramatic. And my modulation source is, again, this triangle LFO that I have down here. And we can see this in real time. What I'm going to do is bias this value module to 0 and use my mod wheel. We're going to look at the output of the multiplier. Right? As I bring the value module down, the range that's outputted from the range of the output of the multiplier is much narrower, because what's happening here is that our frequency is very low. So again, it compresses how far that depth turned all the way negative will go. And as we raise the value module and increase our bias point for our filter, the depth becomes greater until when we're at 1, it goes all the way from 0 to -1. So again, if our filter is biased to 1, 0 to -1 just means this whole range. So that's one way, one very common way in which I use the multiplier. If you took out the depth control and just had it so that it used so that it used the output of this switch, you could create the sort of ramping that you find in Chase Bliss audio pedals, you know, which go from some point on the knob to the top and then back, or some point on the knob in the bottom and back. And so, you know, this is the you know, secret sauce, I think, to a lot of really quick and useful modulation controls, where you don't have to calculate, you know, connection strengths or worry about the modulation exceeding the range of the parameter or anything like that. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of that. It's a way of getting ZOIA to do those calculations for you. And so that's why I like it. You know, again, it adds a little bit of CPU, but I think it's really worth it in a lot of cases. Maybe not every case, but a lot of cases. And then I just add in the push button because it's an easy way to kill the modulation if I don't want to modulate that parameter. But of course, turning the depth to 0 would have the same effect. And, you know, you don't have to get it quite at 0. So the final aspect of the multiplier I want to talk about is waveform mixing. And this is a little bit different from what I showed you before, where one waveform could be used to control the amplitude of another waveform. In this case, what we're doing is really mixing two waveforms together. I've set it up for a simple two waveform mixer. There's some notes on the tips and tricks page that Willem Zenhorst put on the ideas page months and months ago about how to do a three signal blender so that you can blend from waveform A to B and then from B to C. This is just blending from A to B, and the way that it does that is by using multipliers to control the depth of the two waveforms and then summing them together. So what we have is another value module. This will control the blend going into a CV invert, and then the CV invert is going into a value module biased to 1. So this again gives us the inverse of this value module between 0 and 1. If we just used an inverter, we would get the negative version of this. So, you know, if we look at that, we have 4.846 and we get negative 4.846. But what we want is two, essentially two depths that are in relation to one another, so that as one depth increases, the other one will decrease. So we take the output of our value module and we send it into one multiplier that one of our waveforms is going into. And what I have set up here is a pretty quick moving random module clocked by a square wave LFO. So if we look at its output, we see random values scattered all over. Sometimes you get clusters, sometimes you don't, because it's giving you random outputs. Then I'm using the LFO, the triangle wave LFO that I've been using throughout this video, which is a pretty familiar shape. So the value module controls one output, and the output that's inverted between 0 and 1 controls the output, the depth of the other waveform through a multiplier. These are two multipliers, right? So they're controlling the relative depths. And then, you know, you can just send these multipliers directly to the destination, or you could send them into another multiplier to set a depth control or whatever. What I've done, just for the purposes of illustration, is I've sent them both into a value module before sending them on to our filter's cutoff frequency, just so we can see what this looks like as we blend. And I'm gonna take a moment to use, once again, the mod wheel of my MIDI controller to blend between things while still showing the output. So this is the mod wheel at 100%. And as I blend it back, you'll see the random values begin to get sort of a shape where they start going up and down a little bit more. And as we keep going, we start getting more and more of a triangle shape. And then finally we have a triangle. And I'm going to play a few notes just to show what this sounds like. Right, our triangle. Let's increase the blend a little bit. So it's still at that point pretty recognizably a triangle, but there's some edginess to it. Some fluctuations. We can keep moving along. And you can still sort of hear a triangle even at this high blend, because it's, you know, controlling essentially half of the wave. These values are pretty random, they sound random, but they go up and down because of the triangle wave. We can increase our blend. And the triangle wave becomes a little bit harder to pick out, but you can still hear it, you know, again, controlling the oscillation. And now we've got pretty much, a random output, although if we look at it, there's still some shape. You can sort of pick out a triangle wave in there that's limiting and controlling where the peaks and valleys of those random values are. And then finally, that's pure random. I'm going to push this up even higher. So the multiplier, because it can control the depths of these two waves in relation to one another, is essential here, along with this ability to invert our value between 1 and 0 so that we can have depths that are related to one another. When this is at, let's call it 35%. When this is at 35%, this is at 65%. Again, this output is pretty different from if I just used the random module. I'm going to disconnect this now. And I'm going to disconnect this now. If I just use the random module to control the depth of the triangle, what I get is stuff that is still, again, governed by the triangle, but it's all over beneath the curve of that triangle, rather than being added and subtracted from the triangle shape. So, I mean, that's also a very cool sound that's worth exploring. But it's two different sounds, and so that's a way in which the multiplier can be used to combine waves that is different from just using the amplitude of one to control the amplitude of the other. You can set them up so that they mix and have a full amplitude range, but that amplitude range is the summation of the two waves rather than one being multiplied by the other. So that's it on multipliers. There are so many things that I couldn't cover, and there are things that I have yet to discover about the multiplier. I realize at this point that this video is already very long, and if you're still listening and watching, first of all, I appreciate it, and I hope that it was elucidating. But the takeaway is that the multiplier is this hub that can be used to control so many different CV interactions. And so, it may be a little bit mystifying at first, but I really think that if it's a module that you haven't explored much, you should start looking at different ways to use it. So again, I hope this was helpful. Thank you. And again, everyone out there, at the time that I'm making this video, please stay safe, follow recommended procedures, and I hope that you remain healthy and that the people in your life that you care about remain healthy. So thank you again,